Let me tell you something before we go on. I did not have any grand plans for what I was going to do after I paid off the lien. As the time ran short, I knew my name was getting loose in other people's mouths, and that is a dangerous thing in a small county. Once talk starts, it does not need proof to keep moving. It only needs a place to sit down and be repeated until folks forget where they first heard it and begin to think they knew it all along. The whispering started at church before it ever reached the sheriff's office. That is how it always was in Cabarrus County. News did not travel down the road first. It traveled through the quiet spaces between hymns and handshakes, where women leaned close over the backs of pews and men lowered their voices near the door, like the threshold itself might carry tales outside. Chapel Hill had cleared away my fears, but the fact of what I was doing still lingered, and memory in a small county does not need proof to stay alive. All it needs is one old fear and one new reason to dress it up. I felt the air shift before I heard anything directly. Heads held my direction a fraction longer when I came in. Conversations paused and resumed with a different tone, like folks were adjusting their words to make room for an unseen listener. Nobody accused me. Nobody spoke my name alongside the word liquor. Still, the pattern was familiar enough that I recognized it the way you recognize weather in your joints, not from one sign, but from the whole room settling into a shape you have known before. A county can hold back its tongue and still let you know it is thinking. On Sundays, I sat beside Mama and sang the hymns without exaggeration, keeping my face calm the way Granny said in her notebook. She said, if you look guilty, people will decide you are. Still, the preacher's voice carried out firm and even from the pulpit, and his sermon circled temperance and discipline in a way that might have been coincidence and might not. When you are doing wrong, you start hearing sermons like they were written to chase you, even if they were not. I watched hands lift to turn pages in worn hymnals, and I watched how quick some folks were to look anywhere but at me, like avoiding my eyes might spare them from being asked to choose a side. After service, Daddy lingered near the steps with two other deacons, their heads inclined together in that solemn, restrained way men have when they mean to discuss something troubling. His hands stayed folded the way they always stayed folded when he was containing himself. I could not tell whether he was holding judgment or worry or only habit. Eli stood near the hitching rail with his hat in his hand, waiting like he often did after church. When his eyes met mine, there was no accusation in them, only that steady earnestness he had always had. Something else underneath that look felt like he already knew the day was not done with me yet. He gave me the smallest nod, no more than courtesy required, and for some reason that bothered me more than staring would have. The next afternoon, I heard a car on the drive and knew at once it had come with purpose. It didn't sound like a grocery run or a neighbor dropping by to borrow a tool. I was up at the barn, checking the seal on one of the larger barrels, when I heard the gravel shifting and crunching. I looked out the window and saw Backlash lift his head and flick one ear toward the house. Then everything went strangely still. Even the flies around him seemed to settle a little, as if the air itself had turned to listening. I wiped my hands on a cloth and stepped toward the barn door, mash scent clinging to my sleeves in a way I could not wash out, even with extra scrubbing. Besides my ecopiment, the barn held damp wood and old iron, and under those scents there was a sweet, sour edge that meant grain was turning into something else whether anybody approved or not. Sunlight lay across the floor in long, angled strips. Dust drifted through it, slow and innocent, the way harmless things always do when danger is coming. I remember thinking, before I even saw who it was, that there are moments when a body understands trouble, a breath before the mind catches up. Eli stepped from the car alone, and the space around the barn tightened, like a cinch strap pulled one notch too far. He did not rush towards the barn. His hat sat square, his collar buttoned despite the heat pressing down from a pale sky. The badge on his chest caught light for a moment, before settling back into shadow. I wondered how a pointed piece of tin changes the way every person in a county breathes when it is around. The man wearing it may be the same man you saw at church or on Main Street, but once that badge gets there first, Every word afterward must pass through it. He called out in the same tone he used on courthouse steps and at church suppers. I answered and met him at the threshold, keeping my face open and ordinary, though my pulse had already begun running away. I held myself where he could see my hands, because there are habits you learn without being taught, and one of them is you do not give a lawman a reason to imagine you are hiding something. Eli noticed that. I know he did. He noticed most things, and usually acted like he had not, which can make a person more uneasy than if he were the suspicious sort outright. He paused like he was not sure exactly how to proceed. He let out a deep breath and said the sheriff had heard some noise about this place and asked him to take a look around. He didn't say my name alongside the place, and he did not say he believed what he had heard. He said only that he had been asked, which is how decent men speak when they are trying to do a hard thing without turning it cruel. I could hear him laying the weight where it belonged, on the request and not on me, but that did not make my stomach unclench. The tightness rose to my throat, and I felt my plans for the day changing. I lied and said I didn't have anything to hide. I told him he was welcome to look around. Eli entered slow, not prowling and not theatrical. His boots sounded hollow against the plank floor. His gaze moved over the barrels, the feed, the stacked boards, the ladder rising toward the upper tiers, and the shadowed runs of tier poles above. He looked like he was cataloging instead of hunting, and I could not tell whether that was mercy or just what lawmen did. I stayed close enough to answer anything he asked, and far enough back that it did not look like I was crowding him. I know crowding makes a man curious, and curiosity is how things get found. The whole time I could hear my own breathing in a way I hated, steady enough outwardly, but too loud inside my head. After my renegotiation with Cass, I had tightened up the operation. Nothing stayed assembled when not in use. The copper pieces were separated, some stowed above on planks laid across the tiers under canvas, others resting among tools, an old harness where metal did not look out of place. I had learned to think in shapes and glints, in what a beam of light could catch if it struck at the wrong angle, and I had learned that objects will betray you if you get lazy. It is one thing to hide something from a stranger. It is another to hide it from a man raised among outbuildings, tobacco sheds, stock pens, and curing barns. A farm boy grown into a deputy knows how places speak when their owners think they are quiet. Eli paused near one barrel and rested his hand against the wood like he was only testing its firmness. He leaned to peer into a dim corner where rope and weathered boards leaned together, and his jaw tightened faintly, not in anger but in concentration. He said it smelled like feed, almost to himself, and I told him it was. My voice stayed steady because when your voice changes, people hear it even if they do not know what it means. I could feel the lie in the air anyway. Not because the words were false exactly, but because they were not the whole of the place. Feed was there. So were other things. Truth and concealment can sit right next to each other, and often do. He crossed to the other side and looked up toward the upper tiers. The ladder stood in its usual place. His gaze stayed there a beat longer than anywhere else, and I felt that weight settle in my chest, because I knew exactly what waited up there. Rough planks had been laid across 2 of the tier runs, near the far wall, enough to hold a few things out of easy sight. I thought about Granny's advice of storing what mattered overhead, out of easy reach. You make it trouble to reach it. I also thought about how hope and laziness can begin to resemble one another after a while. She wrote that a person says, "She has hidden something well," when what she really means is she has grown used to seeing it and mistakes familiarity for safety. He walked beneath those upper poles and tipped his head back a little farther. Dust danced in the slatted light above him. One of the old planks gave a faint, dry creak as the heat shifted in the roof. I thought, there it is. Now he will climb. My body did not move, but everything in me braced for the sound of his boot on the first rung. Instead, he lowered his eyes again and moved toward the tack room, where bridles, a broken singletree, and 2 feed scoops hung on nails. He touched none of it. He only looked around in the way a man looks when he is deciding whether to honor his instructions or his conscience. By this point, the barn had gone so quiet that every small sound rose sharp. A horsefly hit one of the boards, and buzzed angry for a second before flying off. Somewhere outside, a crow called from the edge of the field. A little sweat ran down between my shoulder blades and cooled there under my dress. Eli took off his hat and wiped his brow with his shirt sleeves. Then he turned back toward me and said, "There was nothing out of the ordinary here." Those words landed quiet between us. I inclined my head once and kept my face from showing relief, because relief can look too much like confession if the wrong person is watching. Eli replaced his hat and stepped toward the door. Outside, the light looked sharper than it had inside. He stopped by the car with his hand on the door handle and told me to keep things tidy. That little phrase carried more meaning than it had any right to. I told him I would, making the words sound like agreement and not gratitude. Then he looked at me fully, like he was fixing my face in his memory. It wasn't an accusation. It was a steadiness that felt less a condemnation and more like a choice he had decided to take up. He got in, started the engine, and turned back down the cut toward the road. The brown dust rose and hung in the air and settled slow against fence posts and weeds like the land itself was relaxing. I stood in the doorway until the car back on the main road. The pasture went back to itself. Backlash dropped his head and tore another mouthful of grass. A breeze moved through the sycamore by the branch, and a hawk screamed somewhere in the woods. After a breath or two, I let my shoulders loosen. I thought the danger had passed in the one shape that I hadn't expected. Then I turned back inside, and my eye caught what I had missed. The copper cap from the still hung on a nail near the door where I had set it to dry after washing. It caught a thin blade of sunlight slipping through a seam in the boards. It did not resemble common hardware, so there was no mistake in seeing what it was. I stepped over and lifted it down with steady hands. The metal felt cool against my palm. Eli had stood not 6 feet from it. I was sure he had turned in that direction. I could not honestly tell myself he had not seen it. Lying to yourself is how you get careless the next time, and the next time is usually the one that finishes you. That realization did not strike like panic. It moved through me slower than that and deeper. He had chosen where to let his eyes rest and where to let them move on. I stood there holding that copper cap and understood that choice for what it was. Not protection promised, only risk assumed quietly. Gratitude rose in me, but it did not soften me. It sharpened me. A kindness like that, if that is what it was, did not make me safe. It only showed me how close danger had stood to my elbow without speaking. Then I climbed the ladder and rearranged everything with a harsher kind of care. I pushed the coil deeper beneath rope and scrap wood on those planks laid across the tiers. I wrapped the cap in burlap and tucked it into a crate that once held nails, so even its shape would not catch a quick glance. I shifted a bucket that sat too clean in the corner, because clean can look like recent work, and recent work invites questions. I moved one of the planks above so the eye would not travel too easy toward the canvas. I looked at the whole place as if I were entering it for the first time with suspicion already in me. That is a hard thing to do, but it is a useful thing. When I climbed down, the barn no longer felt like refuge. It felt like a room full of decisions, some good, some not good enough. I stood in the middle of it with the ladder to one side, the sealed barrels to the other, and tried to picture what Eli had seen when he looked at me in that doorway. Not just a woman with feed and tack behind her, not just a deputy doing what he had been sent to do. Something more tired than that, and more dangerous too. He had chosen restraint, and I knew restraint can cost a decent man more than cruelty ever does. Cruel men do not lose sleep over what they do to others. Outside, I pulled the barn doors back together. The opening now narrowed to a seam of light. Not shut all the way, just narrowed. That thin line lay across the floor the same way it always had, and for once, it did not look ordinary to me. It looked like the sort of opening through which a life can be seen if you are foolish enough to leave it there. I stood listening for any sound of a car returning, any second pass of tires on gravel, any change in the air that might tell me his mercy had been overruled before he reached the road. None came. The quiet held. Even so, I walked away from the barn carrying a new kind of fear, not the loud kind that is felt in your bones, not the kind that sends a body running away. It was the kind that teaches you to be more cautious than scared. Granny wrote that sometimes fear drives the work you do today, so tomorrow does not arrive with handcuffs and a face that refuses to care.